All right, everyone get ready because today we're going deep on something most of you probably grew up with,
Oh, yeah.
the Little
I love
Rascals.
the Little Rascals. We've got like articles and behind the scenes stuff, trivia, even some like scholarly books about the series.
Um,
Yeah,
right.
you think it's all just like innocent fun,
It is
right?
just good old nostalgia. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But trust me,
Okay.
there are layers here, like some really surprising stuff
Okay.
about how the whole franchise like changed over time and the
Yeah.
historical context and even what happened to those kids when the cameras stopped rolling.
It is interesting how something that seems like so simple and so purely entertaining can actually like open a window into a bunch of complex issues.
Yeah.
Talking about race and gender,
Yeah.
the realities of early Hollywood.
It's wild, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
all have those images in our heads, right?
For sure.
Alfalfa with that crazy cowlick
Oh, yeah.
and Spanky trying to keep everyone in line.
Uh-huh.
Buckwheat, just being buckwheat.
Yeah.
But behind all those characters is a story that I think says a lot about America itself.
And what's really interesting is the timeline. I mean, this is a franchise that goes all the way back to the 1920s as Our Gang, those shorts,
Oh, yeah.
that eventually became the Little Rascals.
Right.
And the fact that they're still resonating with people today,
Right.
almost a century later, like, that means something.
It really does.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting because we're not just rewatching, the shows from our childhood,
Yeah.
but we're looking at how the series kind of challenged and reflected the norms of like way back when.
Totally.
Like, did you know that Our Gang was actually really groundbreaking for having a racially integrated cast?
Yeah, I mean, just think about it, the 1920s, right? Like
Yeah.
super intense segregation in a lot of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And you got this group of kids,
Yeah.
Black, white, Asian, just like hanging out together on screen.
Yeah, there's
That was a huge statement.
even if they didn't always get it right.
Right, and that's where it gets, I think, a little more complex.
Okay.
Because the series, it wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
There are definitely scenes and storylines that would make people raise their eyebrows today.
Oh, for sure.
In fact, the NAACP got involved and they actually pushed to get certain episodes removed from syndication.
Wow.
Yeah, because they had some pretty offensive racial stereotypes.
That's wild.
It's not even just about a few jokes that missed the mark. I mean, this was part of a much bigger movement
Yeah.
to really challenge these harmful stereotypes in the media
Yeah.
and push for more equitable representation. I mean, they recognized how powerful these images were, especially when it came to influencing kids.
Totally.
So we've got this crazy mix, right?
Yeah.
Of progressive casting and then some, let's just say, less enlightened moments.
Yeah.
But what I think is really fascinating is how specific scenes that we might have just thought were funny as kids
Right.
actually show us a lot about how things were back then.
Yeah.
Like, remember that episode, A Lad in a Lamp,
Uh-huh.
where Stymie, rubs that magic lamp and makes his wishes?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
It is. Really is.
I mean, on the surface, it's just classic Little Rascals.
Yeah.
Innocent kids, a little bit of like magical thinking.
Right.
But then you listen to those wishes.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
This is a snapshot of a very particular time.
Yeah.
He wishes for like fried chicken and for his father to be out of jail.
Yeah.
I mean, things that they probably thought were funny back then,
Right.
but definitely have a different meaning today.
They definitely hit different today.
It makes you think about how much has changed
Totally.
and how something that was totally fine as entertainment then
Yeah.
could be seen as insensitive or even offensive now.
For sure. And it's not just race, right? I mean,
Yeah.
gender roles were pretty strict back then, too.
Oh, totally. Remember the He-Man Woman Haters Club?
Oh, yeah. I
Right.
mean, the He-Man Woman Haters Club is like textbook how comedy can reflect what society's thinking.
What do you think that episode says about how people saw gender roles back then?
On one level, it's silly kid stuff.
Yeah.
But on another, it's like this idea that boys and girls have to be totally separate.
Right.
Like there's this natural conflict between them.
Yeah. Speaking of the He-Man Woman Haters Club, it actually helps clear up a pretty common myth.
Oh, yeah.
Some people think that Buckwheat was a girl.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I did not know that.
but he was a boy. I mean, he was a proud member of that club.
Right, a He-Man.
Exactly.
That's funny how those little details stick with you.
They do.
But it does confirm Buckwheat was a boy.
For sure.
It leads us to another part of this deep dive, though.
Okay.
The actual lives of these actors.
Right.
Because behind all the funny stuff on screen, there's this whole other story about what it was actually like to be a kid in, like, early Hollywood.
Yeah, things weren't always so happy-go-lucky on set.
No, they weren't. Like, have you heard those stories about Petey the dog? He was not the lovable pooch we saw on screen.
Apparently not.
From what I've read, Petey was kind of a terror on set.
Oh, no.
He even bit some of the kids.
Really?
Yeah, and it makes you think, it's this whole illusion
Yeah.
that Hollywood was putting out behind those smiles and all the slapstick.
Yeah.
There's a story about real kids dealing with a pretty tough industry.
Yeah, and speaking of tough,
Yeah.
things could get really rough on set.
Oh, yeah.
I read that Shirley Temple, who was a child star around the same time,
Okay.
described this like black box punishment
What?
where they would put misbehaving kids in a box with a big block of ice.
No way.
Yeah. Wow.
That's crazy.
It's a huge contrast to like the fun and lighthearted feel of the show.
Totally.
And it makes you think about how difficult and exploitative the conditions for these child actors really were.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder what it was like for those kids to be thrown into that world.
I know.
But on a lighter note,
Okay.
let's change gears a bit.
And talk about what happened to these little rascals after they were done filming. The classic.
Yeah. Where are they now?
Yeah, where are they now?
It's always so interesting to see how these child stars handle life after being famous.
It really is a mixed bag when you look at what happened to them.
Yeah.
Some went on to have pretty great careers in Hollywood. Others struggled,
Yeah.
both personally and professionally.
It's a reminder that there's no one story for child stars.
Right.
It's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, I'm curious about something.
Okay.
We've been talking about how groundbreaking our gang was for its racial diversity,
Right.
but also how some of it wouldn't be okay today.
Totally.
How do you think they navigated all of that back then?
Well, I mean, you got to remember, we're talking about a different time.
Yeah.
A time when what was considered normal was very different.
Totally.
What might seem shocking or offensive to us now was just normal back in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, it's easy to judge the past by today's standards.
But you have to try to understand the context.
Exactly. And that's what makes our gang so fascinating.
Yeah.
It was progressive in some ways, like having an integrated cast.
Yeah.
But it also showed the prejudices of that time.
Like those scenes we were talking about earlier
Yeah.
with Stymie's Wishes.
Right.
Those were meant to be funny,
Yeah.
but they relied on stereotypes
Yeah.
that we now see as really offensive.
Yeah.
And those weren't just one-offs either. Those
Uh-huh.
kinds of things were all over the series.
Yeah.
Sometimes subtle, sometimes not so much.
Right.
So how do we make sense of those problematic parts
Yeah.
with the fact that The Little Rascals was so popular and so loved?
That's a tough question.
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Some people say that we should just enjoy it for the comedy and not focus on the bad parts.
Right.
Others think it's important to talk about the problems, acknowledge the harm they might have caused,
Yeah.
and use it as a way to learn and grow. I mean, how can we learn from the past if we pretend it was perfect?
Exactly.
And then there are some who think that these works are just too problematic
Uh-huh.
and should just be left behind.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue.
It is.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
I think it comes down to each person's own perspective
Yeah.
and how they choose to engage with these tough parts of our culture.
It's a conversation worth having, for sure.
Absolutely.
But maybe for now we can shift gears a little
Uh.
and talk about some of the actors who did go on to have pretty successful careers.
Yeah.
Robert Blake is a good example.
Oh, yeah. He had a long and successful career.
Yeah, and movies like In Cold Blood and the show Beretta
Right.
and Carl Switzer,
Uh-huh.
who played Alfalfa.
Yeah.
He kept acting too.
He did, but his life was cut short, sadly.
Yeah. It's a reminder that things don't always go smoothly for child stars.
Definitely.
And not every kid from our gang made it big.
Right.
Like Matthew Stymie-Beard.
Yeah.
He kept acting, but it seemed like he had trouble breaking away from that character he played as a kid.
Right. And Billy Buckwheat Thomas had a similar experience.
Yeah, it's not unusual for child actors to have trouble getting adult roles.
No, it's not.
They get typecast.
Yeah.
Plus, there's a lot of pressure to stay successful in a really tough industry.
It's a tough business.
And then just the fact that growing up in front of cameras
Yeah.
can't be easy.
Not at all.
It makes you wonder what the long-term effects are,
Yeah.
especially for the ones who don't become super famous.
Yeah, it can be a wild ride, exciting and unforgiving.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that those smiling faces
Yeah.
often hide a much more complicated story.
And speaking of complicated stories,
Okay.
there's one Where Are They Now? Story I find really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Kevin Jamal Woods, who played Stymie in the 1994 movie. You know, the whole online misidentification thing?
Oh, yeah, the internet can be a weird place,
It can.
especially when it comes to spreading false information.
Okay, so for people who haven't heard about this, there were
Mm.
all these before and after pictures online,
Ah,
supposedly showing the Little Rascals cast all grown up.
roll.
And for Kevin Jamal Woods, there's this one picture
Yeah.
that gets shared a lot.
Uh-huh.
And the guy in the picture looks nothing like how you'd imagine Stymie would look as an adult.
It's crazy how these things can just spread online.
It is.
But get this,
Yeah.
that picture isn't even Kevin Jamal Woods.
Wait, seriously?
Seriously.
So who is it?
Nobody seems to know for sure
Wow.
how this random picture got tied to his name.
Uh-huh.
But it's been going around for years,
Wow.
causing all sorts of confusion and false info.
It's like a digital game of telephone gone wrong.
Yeah.
But what about the real Kevin Jamal Woods?
Right.
Where is he? What does he actually look like?
Well, that's the thing. He's kept a super low profile since the Little Rascals.
Really?
There's barely any information out there about him. It's like he just disappeared.
You'd think in this day and age, with everyone online all the time, it'd be impossible to stay hidden like that.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But it just shows you that you can still choose to live your life away from the spotlight,
Right.
even if you were part of something as big as the Little Rascals.
You know, I actually find that kind of refreshing.
Me too.
In a world where everyone's life is all over social media,
Yeah,
it's nice to know some people can still choose privacy.
I agree. And, it's his right to have privacy.
Yeah.
He doesn't owe the public any updates on his life.
Right.
He can live how he wants,
Yep.
away from all the attention that usually comes with being famous.
So we may never know what the real Kevin Jamal Woods looks like grown up,
Probably not.
and that's okay.
It is. And it makes this whole deep dive even more interesting.
It does.
Sometimes the best stories are the ones with a little mystery.
Well, this has definitely been a journey.
It has.
We've talked about so much, from how the franchise changed over time to what it was like behind the scenes, the social context,
Right.
and the stories of the actors themselves. It's all those individual stories, those glimpses into their lives that really make this whole thing come alive.
They do.
And it makes you wonder about the other actors we haven't talked about in detail, like Ross Bagley, who played Buckwheat, and Blake McIver Ewing, who was Waldo.
Uh-huh.
What happened to them?
Right.
Did they keep acting?
Yeah.
Did they go on to do totally different things?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it shows how much there still is to learn about the Little Rascals.
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect way to lead into something we haven't mentioned yet.
Okay.
The really in-depth stuff for those who want to go even deeper.
You mean like the scholarly stuff?
Exactly.
Mm.
We've been focusing on the more popular, easier to understand parts of the Little Rascals.
Yeah.
But there's a whole other level of analysis out there.
So for our listeners who are super curious, where should they start?
Yeah.
What are some of the must-read books?
Well, if you really want to understand the history and the social impact of the Little Rascals, you can't go wrong with Julia Lee's book, Our Gang, A Racial History of the Little Rascals.
I've heard great things about that one.
It's really good.
It sounds like it really gets into how the series both challenged and reinforced racial stereotypes of that time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lee doesn't shy away from the tough stuff.
Yeah.
And she gives a really balanced perspective on how Our Gang dealt with race relations in early 20th century America.
And for a more general overview of the franchise, I've always liked Leonard Maltin and Richard W. Band's The Little Rascals, The Life and Times of Our Gang.
That's a classic.
It's packed with behind-the-scenes stories,
Yeah.
cast biographies, and even a complete list of all the films.
That's a great one for anyone who wants the full story.
Yeah.
From the silent era all the way through.
Yeah, it's amazing how much stuff is out there.
It is?
You could spend weeks going through all the books, articles, documentaries about the Little Rascals.
It really shows how much people are still interested in this franchise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what makes it so cool to do a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
We're not just reliving our childhoods.
Right, yeah.
We're finding all these layers of meaning and complexity that we might not have even realized were there.
You know, as we've been talking about all this, I've been thinking about how the Little Rascals fits into this bigger conversation about nostalgia
Yeah,
and how we look at things from the past through modern eyes.
that's a great point.
Yeah, nostalgia can be powerful,
It can be.
but you have to be careful not to just romanticize the past.
Right.
and ignore the problematic parts of these old shows and movies.
Totally.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it?
It is.
We can love the things that made The Little Rascals so great. The
Uh-huh.
humor, the innocence, the heartwarming moments,
Right.
while also knowing that some parts haven't aged well.
Exactly. And I think that's the main takeaway from this deep dive.
Yeah.
The Little Rascals is more than just a trip down memory lane.
It is.
It's a reflection of its time,
Mm-hmm.
with all its ups and downs.
And by looking at those complexities,
Yeah.
we can understand our own history better,
Right.
our values, and how entertainment shapes and reflects our world.
Well said.
Yeah.
And hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners something to think about
Yeah.
and maybe inspired them to check out some of those resources we mentioned.
Definitely, because that's what this show is all about.
Likely.
Sparking curiosity and leaving you with more questions than answers.
The goal.
So until next time,
Yeah.
keep digging, keep questioning, keep those minds engaged.
And remember, there's always something new to discover,
Yes.
even in the things we think we know best.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is a mixed bag, you know.
Right.
When you look at, like, where they ended up.
Yeah.
Some did great in Hollywood, others not so much,
Yeah.
on both a personal and professional level.
And it just reminds you that there's no single child star story, right? It's
Wow.
different for everyone. But before we get into the specifics, I'm curious.
Okay.
We've been talking about how groundbreaking our gang was
Uh-huh.
for its racial diversity,
Yeah.
but also how some of the content just wouldn't fly today.
Right.
How do you think they managed to handle all that back then?
Well, you got to remember, it was a different time.
Right.
Societal standards were just different.
Totally different.
What might seem shocking to us now
Yeah.
was just normal back in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah. It's easy to judge the past
It is.
by today's standards.
Totally.
But you have to try to understand the context.
You do, and that's what makes our gang so interesting to me.
Yeah.
It was progressive in some ways, like with the diverse cast,
Right.
but it also reflected those prejudices of the time.
Like those scenes we talked about with
Yeah.
Stymie's wishes and a lad on a lamp.
Exactly. Those scenes were meant to be funny,
Of course.
but they use stereotypes that we now know are really offensive.
Yeah. And those weren't isolated incidents.
No, they weren't. Those kinds of representations were kind of woven into the whole series.
Right. Sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly.
So how do we reconcile that,
Yeah.
those problematic elements, with the fact that everyone loves the Little Rascals?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Some people say just enjoy the show for what it is.
Yeah.
Don't focus on the bad stuff.
The comedy.
Exactly. Others say it's important to talk about the problems,
Yeah.
recognize the harm they may have caused,
Right.
and use them as a learning experience.
Right.
How can we learn from the past if we pretend it was perfect?
Exactly.
And then there are those who say some things are just too problematic
Right.
and should be left in the past.
It's tough.
It is a complex issue.
Yeah. There's no simple solution.
No, there isn't. I think ultimately it comes down to the individual
Yeah.
and how they choose to engage with these difficult parts of our cultural history.
Yeah. It's a conversation worth having.
But for now, maybe we can shift gears
Oh,
and
yeah.
talk about some of the actors
Fair.
who did have notable careers
Yeah.
after The Little Rascals.
Absolutely. Robert Blake is a great example.
Oh, yeah.
He had a long and successful career.
In movies like in Cold Blood.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the TV series Beretta,
Right.
and Carl Switzer, who played Alfalfa,
Mm-hmm.
continued acting as well.
He did.
But sadly, his life was cut short.
Yeah, it's a reminder that being a child star is unpredictable
It is.
and not always easy.
Not at all.
And not everyone from our gang found that same level of success.
That's true.
Like Matthew Beard.
Right.
He acted, but it seemed like he had trouble moving on from that role
Right.
from his childhood character.
Yeah, and Billy Buckwheat Thomas had a similar experience.
It's not uncommon, is it?
It's not uncommon for child actors to face challenges.
Yeah,
When they try to transition to adult roles.
right.
There's the whole typecasting thing.
Yeah.
The pressure of staying successful
Uh-huh.
in a very tough industry.
It is a tough business.
And of course, just the fact that growing up in the spotlight
Yeah.
can be really difficult.
It makes you think about the long-term effects,
It does.
especially for those who don't reach that A-list level of fame.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a world that can be exciting,
Yeah.
but also unforgiving.
Right.
It's important to remember that those smiling faces we see on screen
Yeah.
often hide a much more complex reality.
And speaking of complex realities,
Okay.
there's this one Where Are They Now story that I find really fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
The case of Kevin Jamal Woods,
Okay.
who played Stymie in that 1994 movie.
Okay.
You know, that whole online misidentification
Oh,
thing?
yeah. The internet can be a strange and powerful force.
It really can, especially when it comes to spreading misinformation.
Right.
So, for those who haven't heard about this,
Right.
there are all these then and now photos online,
Right?
supposedly showing the Little Rascals cast as adults.
Uh-huh.
And for Kevin Jamal Woods, there's this one photo that gets shared a lot.
Yeah. Showing a man who, well, looks nothing like you'd expect Stymie to look all grown up.
It's amazing how these things take on a life of their own online.
It is.
But here's the thing, that photo isn't actually Kevin Jamal Woods.
Wait,
Sorry,
seriously?
it's someone else entirely.
So who is it then?
That's the mystery.
Oh.
No one seems to know for sure
Hmm.
how this random photo got attached to his name.
Okay.
But it's been circulating for years,
Wow.
leading to all sorts of speculation and false information.
Like a game of digital telephone gone wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
But what about the real Kevin Jamal Woods?
Right.
Where is he now? What does he actually look like?
Well, that's just it.
Yeah.
He's maintained a very low profile since the Little Rascals.
Really?
There's very little information available about his life after the film. It's
Oh.
almost as if he vanished from the public eye.
You'd think in today's hyper-connected world,
You would.
it'd be impossible to stay off the grid like that.
You'd think so,
Yeah.
but it just goes to show that it's still possible. Right.
To choose a life away from the spotlight,
Yeah.
even if you were once a part of something as big as the Little Rascals.
You know, I actually find that kind of refreshing.
I do too.
In a world where everyone's life is plastered all over social media.
Yeah.
It's nice to know that some people can still opt for privacy.
I agree. And it speaks to his right to privacy.
Yeah.
He doesn't owe the public any explanations or updates about his life.
No.
He's free to live on his own terms,
Exactly.
away from the constant scrutiny that often comes with fame.
So we may never know what the real Kevin Jamal Woods looks like as an adult.
Probably not.
And that's perfectly fine.
It is, and it adds another layer of intrigue to this whole deep dive.
It does.
Sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones that remain shrouded in a bit of mystery.
Well, this has certainly been a journey.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the evolution of the franchise to the behind-the-scenes realities,
Right.
the societal context,
Yeah.
and those individual stories
Right.
that make the Little Rascals so much more than just a childhood memory.
Exactly. And it's those individual stories,
Right.
those glimpses into the lives of the actors
Yeah.
that really bring this whole thing to life.
And it makes you wonder about the other actors we haven't talked about in detail.
Yeah.
Like Ross Bagley, who played Buckwheat,
Uh-huh.
and Blake McIver Ewing, who was Waldo.
Right.
What happened to them?
Yeah.
Did they continue acting? Did they pursue completely different paths?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it highlights how much there still is to uncover about the Little Rascals.
There is.
And I think that's a perfect segue into something we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
The deeper dives available
Okay.
for those who want to go even further down this rabbit hole.
You mean like the scholarly work that's out there?
Exactly. We've been focusing on the more popular, accessible aspects
Uh-huh.
of a Little Rascal,
Right.
but there's a whole other level of analysis available
Yeah.
for those who really want to dig deep.
So for our listeners who are feeling extra curious,
Yeah.
where should they start? Where's just some of the must-read books out there?
Well, if you're really interested in the history and, the social impact of the Little Rascals, there's this book, Our Gang, A Racial History of the Little Rascals by Julia Lee.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. I've heard really good things about it.
It's a good one.
Sounds like it really digs into, the whole representation thing
Mm-hmm.
and how the series kind of both challenged and reinforced those racial stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly. Lee doesn't shy away from, the tough stuff.
Yeah.
And she presents a really nuanced look at how our gang dealt with race relations in the U.S.
Back in the early 1900s.
Right.
And for a more general overview of the whole franchise,
Mhm.
I've always liked Leonard Maltin and Richard W. Band's book, The Little Rascals, The Life and Times of Our Gang.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Yeah, it's got all the behind-the-scenes stories and cast bios
Yeah.
and even a complete filmography.
That's a great one for, a comprehensive overview
Yeah.
of the whole series.
Yeah, from the silent era all the way to the later versions.
Exactly.
It's amazing how much material is out there about this.
It is.
You could seriously spend weeks going through all the books and articles
Hmm.
and documentaries about
Yeah.
the Little Rascals.
I mean, it really speaks to how much people are still fascinated by this franchise.
It does, and I think that's what makes doing something like this so rewarding.
Yeah.
We're not just revisiting childhood memories,
Right.
but we're uncovering all this like meaning and clarity that maybe we didn't even realize was there.
Totally.
As we've been talking about all this, it's got me thinking about how the Little Rascals kind of fits into this whole bigger conversation about nostalgia
Yeah.
and how we view things from the past, through a modern lens.
That's a great point.
Nostalgia is powerful.
It is.
But it's important to be critical too. We
Yeah.
can't just romanticize the past
Right.
and ignore the parts of those old movies and shows that were problematic.
Right.
It's a balancing act, right?
It is.
We can love the things that made the Little Rascals so great.
Yeah.
The humor, the innocence, those
Yeah.
heartwarming moments,
Absolutely.
but also acknowledge that some things just haven't aged well.
Exactly. And I think that's the key takeaway from this whole deep dive.
Yeah,
The Little Rascals is more than just a nostalgic trip down memory lane.
it really is.
It's a reflection of its time,
Yeah.
with all its complexities and contradiction.
And by really examining those complexities,
Yeah.
we can learn so much about our own history,
Uh-huh.
our values, and how entertainment really shapes and reflects the world around us.
Well said.
And hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners something to think about.
Yeah.
Maybe even inspired them to check out some of those resources we talked about.
I hope so.
Because that's what this show is all about.
It is.
Sparking curiosity, igniting those aha moments, and, leaving you with more questions than answers.
That's the goal.
So until next time,
Yeah.
keep diving, keep questioning.
Keep those minds engaged.
And remember, there's always something new to discover,
Absolutely.
even in the most familiar things.
Even in the things we think we know best.